Mark and Rachel Cooper seemed like the perfect couple, a decorated police officer and a loving wife, until a shocking TV show revealed a secret affair that would end with one pulling the trigger and the other lying dead. Mark and Rachel Cooper lived in a quiet Texas neighborhood lined with maple trees and identical white fences. Their house was the kind that made people slow down when passing by. Neat garden, polished windows, and a mailbox always freshly painted. To the outside world, they looked like the perfect couple. Mark, a respected police officer, was known for his calm nature and strong sense of justice. He was the kind of man who never raised his voice, who believed in duty, honor, and keeping his promises. Rachel, on the other hand, was the heart of their home. She worked as a nurse at a local hospital, caring for the sick with patience and grace. Her co-workers adored her, and patients often requested her by name. Together, they represented stability, love, and the American dream. A couple who had worked hard to build a peaceful life. They had been married for 12 years, and their bond seemed unshakable. Every Sunday, they went to church together, then spent the afternoon cooking and watching movies. Their neighbors often saw them walking hand in hand in the evenings, laughing about something only they understood. Friends called them the Coopers, the kind of couple everyone secretly wished to be. But behind the soft smiles and picture-perfect moments, cracks had started to form, subtle at first, almost invisible. Mark's long hours at the police station often kept him away, while Rachel's rotating shifts left her exhausted and withdrawn. Their conversations grew shorter, their laughter less frequent. They still said, "I love you," but the warmth in those words was fading. Neither of them realized that their perfect marriage, the one everyone admired, was quietly unraveling, thread by thread, setting the stage for a tragedy that would one day shock their peaceful little town. As months passed, Mark began to sense that something had changed between him and Rachel. It wasn't just the silence at dinner or the way she avoided his eyes. It was something deeper, something he couldn't explain. The warmth that used to fill their home had been replaced by a quiet tension that neither of them spoke about. Rachel, once affectionate and talkative, now seemed distracted. She often appeared lost in thought, staring at her phone or out the window for long minutes. When Mark asked how her day had gone, her answers grew shorter, her smile more forced. She blamed exhaustion from her long shifts at the hospital, but the excuse felt hollow. Mark tried to bring back their old rhythm, movie nights, small surprises, and weekend drives, but Rachel's enthusiasm had vanished. She began spending more time at work, volunteering for extra shifts even when she was clearly tired. She said she was helping the hospital with a staffing shortage, and Mark believed her at first. But her late returns, faint traces of perfume unfamiliar to him, and her reluctance to talk about her day left him uneasy. Nights became lonelier. She would turn away from him in bed, scrolling through her phone until late hours, sometimes smiling faintly at something she read. Mark told himself that marriages went through rough patches, that this was just a phase. But inside, doubt was starting to grow. He noticed how she no longer waited for him to come home, how she barely reacted to his presence. The woman who once kissed him goodbye every morning now barely looked up from her screen. What Mark didn't realize was that the emotional distance forming between them was not accidental. It was the first shadow of betrayal creeping quietly into their perfect life. One quiet night, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Mark sat alone in the living room, finishing paperwork from the station. Rachel was in the bedroom, scrolling through her phone with her back turned to him. Around midnight, she fell asleep, leaving her phone resting on the bedside table. Mark wasn't the type to invade privacy, but something inside him stirred, an unease that wouldn't let him rest. When the screen lit up suddenly, his eyes instinctively moved toward it. A message preview appeared for only a second, but that second was enough to change everything. It read, "Last night was amazing. Can't stop thinking about you." The words hit him like a punch to the chest. His heart began to race, his throat tightening as he stared at the phone, unable to believe what he had just seen. He didn't touch it. He didn't open the message. Instead, he sat there frozen, fighting between trust and suspicion. Every thought in his mind screamed for an explanation, but his heart refused to accept what his eyes had read. Maybe it was a wrong number. Maybe someone was playing a cruel joke. But deep down, he knew better. For the rest of the night, Mark couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, The words replayed in his mind like a haunting echo. He watched Rachel sleep peacefully beside him, wondering who she really was. When morning came, she acted normal, smiling, pouring coffee, and talking about her day as if nothing had happened. Mark stayed silent, pretending everything was fine. But inside, his trust had cracked. That single message became the seed of doubt that began to grow quietly, shaping his thoughts, his behavior, and eventually, his destiny. In the weeks that followed, Rachel's behavior began to shift in ways that were impossible for Mark to ignore. She started caring more about her appearance, spending extra time in front of the mirror before work. New dresses appeared in her closet, ones Mark had never seen before. An unfamiliar perfume lingered in the air long after she left the house. When he asked about the changes, she smiled faintly and said she just wanted to feel more confident again. The explanation sounded reasonable, but the timing felt wrong. Rachel had never needed a reason to be beautiful. She always was. But now, her efforts seemed to be for someone else. Her schedule also began to change. She started leaving for work earlier than usual and returning home much later, claiming she had taken on extra night shifts at the hospital. Sometimes, she came home so late that Mark was already in bed, pretending to be asleep just to avoid confrontation. There were moments when she arrived smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't his, but when he asked about it, she laughed it off, saying she brushed against a patient or a coworker. Mark's instincts as a police officer told him something was wrong, but his heart clung to denial. He wanted to believe her, wanted to keep the illusion of their marriage intact. Yet, every new excuse she gave felt weaker than the last. The house began to feel colder, emptier. Meals were eaten in silence. Laughter had disappeared. And as Rachel's secret life grew stronger, Mark's faith in her, and in himself, began to crumble. He didn't know it yet, but this slow unraveling of truth would soon lead him down a path from which there would be no return. Mark's growing unease eventually pushed him to confide in someone he trusted, his longtime colleague and friend, Officer Dylan Hayes. Dylan had known Mark for over a decade and had seen him handle some of the toughest criminal cases with calm precision. When Mark quietly mentioned that he suspected Rachel was hiding something, Dylan listened carefully. He didn't press for details. He simply advised Mark to be cautious and, if necessary, to gather proof before jumping to conclusions. It wasn't the advice Mark wanted to hear. He hoped for reassurance, for someone to tell him that he was imagining things. But Dylan's silence said enough. Over the next few days, Mark tried to focus on work, but his mind constantly drifted back home. He found himself replaying every moment with Rachel, trying to spot clues he might have missed. The sudden smiles at her phone, the unexplained absences, the new perfume. Every detail now felt suspicious. Dylan noticed the change in his friend. Mark, once sharp and confident, now appeared distracted, irritable, and tired. When asked if he had confronted Rachel, Mark shook his head. He said he couldn't bring himself to accuse her without proof. Instead, he decided to watch quietly. He checked her phone bill, noticing unfamiliar numbers that appeared frequently at odd hours. He even considered following her after work, but stopped himself, fearing what he might find. Deep inside, he still hoped Rachel would come forward and tell him the truth herself. But the truth never came. Dylan warned him that holding everything inside could be dangerous, but Mark dismissed it. He believed he could control his emotions. What he didn't realize was that his silence was slowly turning into resentment, fuel for a storm that was beginning to form inside him. A few weeks later, while Mark tried to bury himself in his work and ignore the growing emptiness at home, the town became obsessed with a new television series called Hidden Secrets, Real Affairs Exposed. The show featured real-life cases of infidelity caught on camera, where private investigators helped people uncover their partner's betrayals. It became an overnight sensation, trending on social media and dominating local conversations. Mark had no interest in such shows. He found them tasteless and cruel. But Rachel, oddly, seemed fascinated. She would watch it every week, glued to the screen, reacting with a mix of nervous laughter and discomfort whenever a new episode aired. Mark often teased her gently about her obsession, trying to lighten the mood, but she brushed it off, claiming she just liked true stories. Still, he noticed something in her eyes whenever she watched, a flicker of unease, as if the story struck too close to home. One evening, while Mark was on patrol, an advertisement for an upcoming episode aired. It promised the most shocking revelation yet, an affair involving a nurse and a doctor from a nearby hospital. The brief teaser showed blurry figures leaving a hotel, their faces hidden but their uniforms recognizable. When Mark returned home that night, Rachel looked pale. She switched the channel quickly when he entered the room. He didn't think much of it then, assuming she was tired or emotional from watching dramatic television. But something about her nervousness stayed in his mind. He didn't know that the show she was watching so intently would soon reveal a truth so devastating that it would destroy everything he believed about love, loyalty, and his own sanity. When the new episode of Hidden Secrets, Real Affairs Exposed finally aired, Mark was at home, resting after a long shift. He wasn't planning to watch the show, but as he flipped through channels, curiosity stopped him on that familiar title. The screen opened with dramatic music and a narrator describing a case of betrayal between a married nurse and a senior doctor at a local hospital. Mark's chest tightened slightly, though he didn't know why. The story felt oddly familiar. When the footage appeared, his blood ran cold. The woman's face was blurred, but her hair, her posture, even the small silver bracelet on her wrist were all unmistakable. It was Rachel. The footage showed her laughing and holding hands with a man as they exited a hotel together, slipping into a car parked discreetly at the back. Though the show kept names hidden, the clues were undeniable. The hotel sign, the hospital name, and even the timing matched Rachel's late-night shifts. Mark froze, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear the television. For a moment, he thought it might be a coincidence, someone who only looked like her. But as the camera caught her turning briefly toward the lens, he saw her face clearly. There was no mistake. He felt the world collapse around him. The woman he loved, the one he had defended in his mind for months, had been exposed in front of thousands of viewers. His hands trembled as he reached for the remote, but couldn't turn off the screen. He sat there, motionless, watching his wife's secret life unfold like a nightmare. In that single moment, Mark Cooper's faith in his marriage, and in everything he thought he knew, was shattered beyond repair. By the next morning, the episode had gone viral. Though the show blurred faces, people in their small Texas town quickly connected the dots. The nurse in the footage wore the same hospital badge, uniform color, and hairstyle as Rachel Cooper. Within hours, gossip spread across social media and through hospital corridors. Co-workers whispered behind her back, and neighbors exchanged knowing looks. By the time Rachel arrived at work, people were staring, pretending to be busy whenever she passed. Her colleagues' smiles had turned into forced politeness. The hospital administration called her in for a brief discussion, but the embarrassment was already irreversible. Mark's phone began to buzz nonstop. Messages from friends and fellow officers poured in, some asking if it was really her, others offering awkward sympathy. He didn't respond to any of them. He sat in silence, staring at the same television that had destroyed his life the night before. His stomach churned as he imagined everyone watching, everyone knowing. The humiliation was unbearable. His reputation, built on integrity and respect, was suddenly tainted by public scandal. When Rachel came home that evening, she looked terrified. She avoided his eyes, mumbling excuses about edited footage and false stories. But Mark barely heard her. Every time she moved, he saw the images from the show replaying in his mind. Her laughter, her touch, her betrayal. He wanted to scream, to ask her why, but no words came out. The silence between them grew heavier than ever. In the eyes of the community, Mark was now the man whose wife had cheated publicly, a husband whose pain had become everyone's entertainment. And in that crushing humiliation, anger began to take root deep within him, quietly, dangerously, and without end. The days that followed were unbearable for Mark. Everywhere he went, he felt the weight of invisible eyes watching him. At the police station, conversations stopped when he entered the room. His fellow officers tried to act normal, but he could sense their pity. The whispers stung more than any insult could. At home, the silence was suffocating. Rachel avoided him completely, retreating into the guest room and locking the door at night. She cooked separately, left early, and came home late. The house that once echoed with laughter now felt cold, like a place haunted by two strangers. Mark stopped talking altogether. He moved through each day like a machine, eating little, sleeping less, his mind replaying the footage over and over. Every time he saw her face on that screen, smiling at another man, His stomach turned. Yet he didn't confront her. Something inside him had broken beyond repair. His anger no longer burned hot. It had turned into a quiet, dangerous calm. He started spending long hours sitting alone in the dark, staring at nothing, his thoughts looping between betrayal and revenge. He found himself cleaning his service weapon more often, running his fingers over the cold metal, feeling its weight as if it offered comfort. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore. The humiliation had grown into obsession. He thought about how everyone had seen what she did, how everyone knew. The woman he loved had not only betrayed him privately, but destroyed his pride publicly. That thought consumed him day and night. Mark's silence, once a sign of restraint, had become the calm before a storm. Beneath his stillness, something deadly was building, an emotion too powerful to control, waiting for a single moment to erupt. The man from the show was soon identified by local gossip as Dr. Alan Reeves, a senior physician at the same hospital where Rachel worked. He was known for his charm, his confidence, and his reputation with women. For years, he had been married to a woman named Victoria, who came from a well-known family in town. When the episode aired, Victoria instantly recognized her husband, just as Mark had recognized Rachel. The revelation shattered 2 homes overnight. Alan's wife filed for divorce the very next morning, and his career began to crumble under the weight of the scandal. Patients canceled appointments, and the hospital administration quietly started investigating both him and Rachel. For Mark, knowing the name of the man only deepened the wound. It wasn't some faceless stranger. It was someone who had sat across from him at community events, shaking his hand and smiling. Mark remembered the few times he had seen Alan before, recalling how polite and confident he always seemed. Now, those memories felt sickening. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was personal. He felt mocked, humiliated, and stripped of dignity by people he had trusted. Meanwhile, the media turned the story into a spectacle. Anonymous sources fed reporters details, and soon, online headlines hinted at the scandalous affair between a local nurse and a prominent doctor. Rachel stopped going to work for several days, hiding inside the house with curtains drawn. But no amount of hiding could protect them from what was coming. Mark's anger, once buried beneath shock and sadness, began to take on a life of its own. Knowing the face of the man who had shared his wife's affection turned Mark's humiliation into rage. Quiet, relentless, and impossible to contain for much longer. The scandal refused to fade. Within days, the hospital administration launched a formal investigation into the alleged affair between Rachel and Dr. Alan Reeves. A team of internal investigators began reviewing work schedules, security footage, and patient records. They wanted to know if the relationship had affected their duties or crossed professional boundaries. Staff members were called in for questioning one by one. Whispers filled the corridors, and even those who liked Rachel before now avoided her completely. The once cheerful nurse, known for her warmth and dedication, became the center of humiliation. Rachel tried to defend herself. She told the investigators that the footage from the show had been edited and manipulated, that it was a case of mistaken identity. But no one believed her. The producers of Hidden Secrets stood by their footage, claiming everything had been verified. Then came the blow that sealed her fate. Private detectives hired by Alan's wife handed over a set of photographs and text messages that left no room for denial. The evidence showed hotel receipts, late-night messages, and even affectionate selfies. The truth was undeniable. Mark heard about the investigation through a fellow officer who worked security for the hospital. When he learned that the detectives had confirmed the affair, something inside him went cold. There was no more room for hope or excuses. The woman he had loved, trusted, and defended had betrayed him completely. At home, Rachel stayed silent, too ashamed to speak, while Mark moved around like a ghost. Their marriage no longer existed. It was just 2 broken people trapped under one roof. But while Rachel drowned in guilt and fear, Mark's emotions were turning darker. The anger he had tried to bury was beginning to demand a way out. Mark tried to continue with his duties at the police department, but everything around him reminded him of what had happened. The respect in his colleagues' eyes had changed to something else, pity. He hated that more than anything. Every morning when he put on his uniform, he felt the weight of shame pressing down on him. The badge that once filled him with pride now felt meaningless. Every whisper in the hallway, every quiet conversation that stopped when he walked by, felt like a reminder of how the entire town knew his private humiliation. He couldn't escape it, not at work, not at home, not even in his own thoughts. Sleep became impossible. He would lie awake through the night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of his marriage, the laughter, the smiles, the vows, and then watching them shatter again in his mind. Sometimes he thought he heard Rachel crying softly in the other room, but he didn't go to her. The distance between them had turned into a wall made of resentment and guilt. Meals went uneaten, conversations never started. The house had become a prison filled with ghosts of what once was. His friends tried to reach out, but Mark withdrew completely. He began skipping shifts, sitting for hours alone in his car outside the station, lost in thought. Rage simmered under his calm surface, but it was no longer loud or explosive. It was silent, heavy, and poisonous. The betrayal had hollowed him out, leaving only anger and pride in its place. He started thinking that maybe the only way to end his pain was to make Rachel feel the same. The thought frightened him at first, but the more he fed it, the more natural it began to feel. The rain fell steadily that evening, blurring the world outside as Mark sat alone in his car, parked a few blocks away from his house. The wipers moved rhythmically, but he barely noticed. His service weapon rested on the passenger seat beside him, gleaming faintly in the dim light. For hours, he just sat there, staring at it, lost in a fog of anger and exhaustion. Every image of Rachel's betrayal replayed in his mind. Her laughter with Alan, the secret messages, the footage that exposed them to the world. The pain had become unbearable, twisting into something darker. He wasn't thinking like a police officer anymore. He was a broken husband, a man who had lost everything he believed in. He reached for the gun, feeling the cold metal against his skin. It felt heavy, powerful, final. A part of him whispered that he should end it all, that the humiliation, the sleepless nights, the pitying looks would finally stop. But another voice, colder and stronger, told him that Rachel deserved to face the same agony he had endured. The thought took root in his mind and refused to leave. As the rain intensified, Mark closed his eyes and imagined confronting her, imagined the look on her face when she realized he knew everything. The fantasy gave him a sense of control he hadn't felt in months. He told himself it wouldn't happen tonight, that he only wanted to scare her, to make her understand the pain she caused. But deep down, he knew where his thoughts were leading. He sat in the darkness, gripping the weapon tighter, unaware that the decision he was making in that moment would seal both their fates forever. That night, the house was silent except for the steady tapping of rain against the windows. Rachel came home later than usual, her clothes damp, her eyes tired and hollow. She moved quietly through the hallway, avoiding Mark's gaze as she hung her coat. The tension between them had grown unbearable, filling every corner of the house. Mark sat on the couch, motionless, the television flickering in front of him. The same show that had destroyed their lives, Hidden Secrets, Real Affairs Exposed, was playing again, replaying scenes of other people's betrayals as if mocking him. Rachel paused when she saw him, her face pale. She tried to walk past him, but something in his stillness made her stop. On the coffee table beside him lay his service weapon, partially visible beneath a newspaper. The sight sent a chill through her, but she said nothing. Mark's eyes followed her every movement. In his mind, the images from the show overlapped with the woman standing in front of him. The same laughter, the same touch, the same lies. The pain he had carried for months swelled until it became too heavy to contain. He stood up slowly, his expression unreadable. The air in the room grew thick, charged with an unspoken truth neither of them could escape. Rachel took a step back, realizing too late that something irreversible was about to happen. The gun felt familiar in his hand, the weight of authority and judgment combined. Time seemed to stop. Outside, thunder rolled through the sky, drowning out every sound except one, a single, deafening gunshot. In that instant, years of love, anger, and betrayal collided into silence. Mark didn't move. He just stood there, staring at what he had done, as the rain continued to fall. The gunshot echoed through the quiet neighborhood, sharp and final, cutting through the sound of rain. Lights flicked on in nearby houses as startled neighbors peered out from behind curtains, unsure of what had happened. Inside the Cooper's home, time seemed frozen. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the air, mixing with the faint scent of Rachel's perfume. Her body lay still on the living room floor, a dark stain spreading across the carpet. The television continued to play in the background, its volume low, narrating another story of betrayal as if mocking the tragedy that had just unfolded. Mark stood motionless, the gun still in his hand, his breathing shallow and uneven. His mind felt blank, emptied of thought, as if his actions hadn't fully registered. The anger that had once consumed him was gone, replaced by a chilling stillness. He stared at Rachel's lifeless form, realizing too late that the silence he had craved had come at an unbearable cost. The woman who had once been his entire world was gone, and nothing could undo what he had done. Outside, sirens began to wail in the distance. Someone had called 911 after hearing the shot. Mark didn't move. He placed the gun gently on the table, his hands trembling. When he finally sat down, he felt an overwhelming emptiness take over. There was no relief, no justice. Only a hollow ache that grew heavier with each passing second. As flashing red and blue lights painted the walls of his home, Mark whispered a broken apology into the silence, but there was no one left to hear it. The once perfect life they had built together now lay shattered, just like the woman at his feet. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the street as police cars and an ambulance pulled up outside the Cooper's house. The flashing lights reflected off the wet pavement, casting red and blue patterns through the rain. Officers surrounded the property cautiously, weapons drawn, expecting the worst. When they entered, they found Mark sitting on the couch, motionless, his uniform still on, his hands resting on his knees. The gun lay on the coffee table in front of him. Rachel's body was a few feet away, the scene hauntingly still. Without resistance or a single word, Mark lifted his hands in surrender. His voice was low, almost calm, as he said he had done it. His fellow officers, men who had once admired and trusted him, looked on in disbelief. They had worked alongside him for years, never imagining they would one day arrest him. The weight of betrayal hung thick in the room, not just between husband and wife, but between a man and the badge he once represented. One officer quietly read him his rights, his voice trembling slightly, while another secured the weapon. Mark didn't protest. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply stared at the floor as they led him outside. The neighbors watched from their windows as the decorated police officer, once a local hero, was escorted into a patrol car, wearing handcuffs. The sight was heartbreaking and surreal. As the car pulled away, the rain continued to fall, washing over the driveway where everything had changed. Inside the house, investigators began their work, photographing every detail, every trace of what had happened. The story that had started with betrayal had now ended with tragedy, and Mark Cooper was no longer the victim of deceit. He was now the criminal. The trial drew massive attention across the state, turning the once quiet suburban tragedy into a national headline. Cameras lined the courthouse steps, reporters shouted questions, and every news channel ran updates about the case of the police officer who killed his wife after a TV show exposed her affair. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Mark sat at the defense table, dressed in a plain suit, his face pale and expressionless. The man who once stood tall in uniform now looked hollow, a shadow of who he had been. The prosecution painted a picture of a man consumed by pride and rage, someone who had planned his wife's murder as revenge for humiliation. They described how he had sat waiting, armed, calm, and deliberate. Photos from the crime scene were shown to the jury. Rachel's body, the gun, the television still flickering with the show that had exposed her. Each image drew gasps from the courtroom. The defense, however, argued that Mark had been pushed beyond his emotional limits, that he had suffered a mental breakdown after months of humiliation and betrayal. They claimed he had acted in a moment of temporary insanity, not as a calculated killer. Witnesses were called, neighbors who heard the gunshot, co-workers who spoke about Mark's growing withdrawal, and experts who testified about the psychological effects of public shame. Through it all, Mark said little. When given the chance to speak, he simply admitted he had lost control. His voice cracked as he said he never meant to kill her, only to stop the pain. The courtroom remained silent. No one knew whether to see him as a murderer or a man destroyed by love, pride, and public exposure. After days of testimony, evidence, and emotional arguments, The courtroom fell silent as the jury returned to deliver its verdict. Mark sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly together, eyes fixed on the floor. The air was heavy with anticipation. When the foreman stood and read the words, "Guilty of second-degree murder," a faint murmur swept through the room. Mark didn't react. He didn't flinch or look up. He simply nodded once, as though he had expected it all along. The judge's voice followed shortly after, sentencing him to 30 years in prison with no chance of parole for the first 15. The gavel struck, and in that single sound, the final chapter of Mark's old life closed forever. Reporters rushed to broadcast the verdict, and by nightfall, the story had spread everywhere. Commentators debated whether justice had been served or if Mark had been another victim of a cruel cycle of humiliation and rage. Former colleagues expressed disbelief, saying he had always been steady and compassionate, a man who helped others stay calm under pressure. But now, his name was associated only with tragedy. As he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Mark glanced briefly toward the empty seat where Rachel's family had once sat. They hadn't returned after the first day of the trial. His eyes lingered there for a moment before he lowered his head. The badge that had once symbolized his honor now lay locked away in an evidence box, marked and forgotten. The world outside the courthouse moved on, but inside Mark, time stood still. He had spent years upholding the law, only to become the one it condemned. The punishment wasn't just the prison walls. It was living every day with the memory of what he had done. Prison life was a harsh new reality for Mark. The cold walls, the constant noise, and the loss of freedom stripped him of everything that once defined him. No longer a respected officer, he was now just another inmate, his name whispered among prisoners who both feared and pitied him. The uniform he once wore with pride had been replaced by a number on his chest. The authority he once commanded meant nothing here. Each day blended into the next. Meals, roll calls, silence, and regret. Nights were the hardest. He would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the image of Rachel's lifeless body and the sound of the gunshot that had ended everything. Letters occasionally arrived from his sister, the only family member who hadn't turned away. She wrote about forgiveness, about finding peace, but her words only deepened his guilt. He never replied. Some days he volunteered in the prison library, sorting books and keeping to himself. Reading gave him temporary escape from the crushing weight of his choices. He avoided confrontation, earned a quiet reputation, and lived in the background. The guards rarely had trouble with him. He followed rules to the letter, as if trying to redeem himself in small, silent ways. Over time, Mark's hair turned gray, and his face carried the lines of exhaustion and remorse. Other inmates came and went, but his punishment felt endless. He never complained, never asked for sympathy. The man who once believed in justice now understood its cruelty in a way he never could before. Every passing year became a reminder that while the world had moved on, he remained trapped, not just behind bars, but inside the consequences of one irreversible moment of rage. 15 years later, Mark finally became eligible for parole. The world outside had changed beyond recognition. New faces, new rules, new technology, but he had changed even more. His once broad shoulders had narrowed, his voice softened with age, and the fire in his eyes had faded into quiet acceptance. When the parole board reviewed his case, they saw a man who had spent every year reflecting, never once breaking a single prison rule. After hours of deliberation, they granted his release. But freedom, after so long, didn't feel like freedom at all. Stepping outside the prison gates, Mark felt the cold wind on his face, the same kind of wind that had blown through his street the night of the shooting. He had no family waiting, no home to return to. His sister had moved away years earlier, and Rachel's family wanted nothing to do with him. With a small bag of belongings, he walked into a halfway house arranged by the state. The silence there was unfamiliar, different from the noise of prison, but just as heavy. In the evenings, he would sit by the window, watching people pass by, families laughing, couples holding hands, lives moving forward. Sometimes he wondered if Rachel's affair would have still happened if they had just talked, if the show had never exposed her. But those thoughts always ended the same way, with the truth that no if could undo what had been done. He began volunteering quietly at a community center, teaching troubled teens about choices and consequences. Few knew who he was, and he preferred it that way. Though his life would never regain what it had lost, Mark found a small sense of peace in helping others avoid the darkness that had once consumed him.